And a very good evening to you, and welcome to Politics 101 on a Thursday evening. Welcome to all of you who are joining us. Those of you who are joining us from in Guyana, a special welcome to you. Hello to all of you who are joining us from the quarantine. Welcome to Politics 101. Those of you from Berbice, New Amsterdam, good evening. Good evening. I did give a special shout out to the people of New Amsterdam yesterday evening. Welcome. Please share the link. Please share the link. Those of you from West Berbice, welcome. Welcome to Politics 101. And all of you from Demerara, Region 4, for the most part. Those of you from the East Coast of Demerara, East Bank, Georgetown, and Georgetown is big, as you know, all the various wards in Georgetown. And those of you from the west side, West Bank of Demerara, we usually forget you up there, people in Bagsville and Stanleytown and Sisters, Nimes, lots of friends in that area, that part of our country. Welcome to Politics 101. Vincent Alexander is here with us tonight, as we promised yesterday. I want to thank all of you who were here last night with GHK Lal, and we had that discussion in Venezuela. Tonight we are going to be talking about race, ethnicity, and politics, and having big people discussion on the issue, not your usual how should I put, simplistic discussion about race and ethnicity, or the kind of combative discourses, but really discussing race, ethnicity, and politics in a real serious way. And Vincent Alexander is already here, so we're going to get going shortly. Good evening, Donna Liverpool, joining us from French Guyana. Those of people of my generation would say Cayenne. And when you say Cayenne, you really mean French Guyana, in the same way you say Paramaribo to mean Suriname. Our brothers and sisters in Suriname and French Guyana, welcome. Welcome to Politics 101. And all of you in North America, in the United States of America, Canada, and you know, geographically, Mexico is North America. We usually think of Mexico as Central America, but Mexico is geographically North America. But geography does not necessarily explain where we're from. You know, the big hullabaloo recently about whether Guyana is part of the Caribbean, and you know, Guyanese people got worked up, and quite rightly, at a school, the young man, you know, the Caribbean has never been an island construction. It's always a regional construction. You know, and people who come to think of the Caribbean islands. Well, they are the Caribbean islands, but the Caribbean region is what the Caribbean has always been. So welcome to those of you in our wider Caribbean, those of you in North America, those of you in Europe, especially our people there in the United Kingdom, especially those of you in England, you know, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, England, you know, teaching a course this semester on Introduction to Africana Studies, where we study the African diaspora, an introductory course, and you know, having to deal with the question of the Caribbean and what the Caribbean is. Always interesting to introduce students to these concepts. And the Caribbean is geographical, but it's also a concept. Welcome. Good evening to all my friends in Canada, in Toronto, and further afield in the Ontario province. And as I was saying, good evening to friends there in the United Kingdom. And I was saying, teaching that class, and a student asked me today about the difference between England and Great Britain and United Kingdom, because she recognized that I was talking mostly about England and the Caribbean, and wanted to know why I didn't say the United Kingdom or Great Britain. And I had to explain that our relationship was mostly with England, Mother England, as we used to refer to that place. But to all our viewers there, welcome. The regulars who join us every night. And by the time we get started, it's in the morning, because 5 hours ahead of Guyana. So we start at 7. So it's midnight in England. And by now it's Friday morning. Good morning to you. And those of you who are joining us from the mother country, and we know it's the mother continent, but we say the mother country for Africans, you know. Care me back a me muma country, care me back home, care me back a me muma country, care me back home. Africa, I want to go back home. Africa, I say a tired roam. Just give me the plane passage, because I'm going back home. Go back to Africa to see my grandmother. So when we think about Africa, we think about Africa as one country, the spirit of Pan-Africanism. And in the same way, although India is a country, India is not a monolith. And most of the people who came as indentured laborers from India came from North India, from Northern India, that area. But there's some who came from South India. I don't know the precise breakdown, but I think it's somewhere about 85%, 80 to 85% of the Indians who came to Guyana and Trinidad and so on came from North India, and then about 15 to 20% came from South India. And it is said that the Indians are referred to as the dark-skinned Indians, the Madrasi, as we call them, Madras Indians. They're the ones who came mostly from the south. So India itself is not a monolith. It's not a monolith. And those of us who are foreparents coming from Africa, we are not a monolith either, because we really came here from different tribes in India, 10 to 15 tribes of West Africa. And it was here in the so-called New World that we were molded together, and we became African in the New World. We became Mati on that slave ship, where I understand the term Mati comes from, meaning Métis. And, over time it became Mati, But here in the so-called Americas, the so-called New World, is where the notion of the African really took root. You take Haiti, and you take voodoo, the folk religion of Haiti. It's really a synthesizing of the various African religions. First, that was the first syncretizing. And then, having pulled those religions together, they then merge it with the Catholic religion, hence voodoo. So you go to Haiti, somebody wakes up in the morning, they go in the church, the voodoo church, worships there first, and then go in the Catholic church. Or as they say, they worship the African gods first, and then the European god. And so, it's a coming together. And if you look at our comfort, you notice the same thing. You know, those who do what they call the all-nation walk, not all-nation walk. You first of all do the all-nation, as in African nation, where is Congo, Coromantee, and Yoruba or whatever, but we're mostly Congo and Coromantee in Guyana. And so there's that all nation, and then there's the ethnic all nation, the African, the Amerindian, the Portuguese, the Chinese God, and so on and so forth. It's really interesting that African folk religion come for. It's so all-inclusive. First of all, it includes a different tendency in the African cosmos, and then the ethnic, all the other ethnic groups, they invoke the spirits of Amerindians, Chinese, Portuguese. We must talk about that another day. The way in which they have democratized and all-inclusive. And a lot of people who chat about race know nothing about race. What do they know of race? Who only race knows, you know? And, you know, the different drum beat can tell you whether it's the Coromantee or, you know, the Congo, you know, as the case may be. But welcome to Politics of One. It's beautiful to be part of the Caribbean, to be part of Guyana, to be part of Africa as race and Africa as ethnicity. I think we're all here by now. We're all here by now, or certainly a critical mass of us. Please share the link, let everyone know that we're on. What we're going to do tonight is Vincent and I are going to walk through some issues. Because you see, we are at a critical time in our history. We have lots of wealth, well, more than we ever had. And because of the increase in wealth, there is an upping of the tempo of the competition among the various groups for access to that wealth. So we have the ethnic or racial contestation for that wealth. We also have class contestation, the rich versus the poor. You know, Bob Marley says, you know, he had that wonderful definition of the class system. Some people got nothing. Some people got hopes and dreams. And some people got ways and means. I think that's part of the song Guiltiness, Rest on Their Conscience. And you know, the artist is so fantastic. Some people got nothing, what we'll call the lower class or working class. Some people get hopes and dreams. In the middle class, we go to school and so on, and we're hoping to get a better job and get promoted and so on. And then some people got ways and means, the rich. Bob Marley defining our class system in the Caribbean as only the artists could do. So we have this competition for wealth. And because we are a racialized society or ethnicized society, however you want to describe it, or ethno-racialized society, the ethno-racial competition for wealth is much more pronounced in the society. And that competition for wealth means that there are conversations that are going on. Conversations within the ethnic groups and between the ethnic groups. And those conversations are going to be very important in shaping the outcome of this contestation for the wealth that we have. And often those conversations are driven by what we call the so-called intellectuals or ideologues that are thrown up by the various groups. And that is why in recent times, in the African Guyanese community, you hear names like Eric Phillips and Vincent Alexander and Nigel Hughes, you know, David Hines, Rickford Burke, etc. These are people in the public space who are seen as articulating an African viewpoint as part of that larger discourse in Guyana. And on the Indian side, people like Ravi Dev and Betoram Ramarak, you know, Vishnu Bishram, and then you have some new ones on the block now, Randy Prasad and these others. These are usually the so-called academics of the groups who are the ones who, in many cases, are driving that discourse in the public view. Kimani Nehilsi on the African side and so on. And there are others whose name I have not called, but those are the main ones. And so the ideologues or the intellectuals are the ones, for good or for worse, who are in a sense driving this discourse. And you have these discourses. And sometimes these discourses are happening together, sometimes they're happening separately. And a couple of weeks ago, I played an excerpt from Betoram Ramarak, Dr. Beto Ramarak, discussing the question of the state. And some of us are arguing that the present state, which is a successor state of the colonial state, has a responsibility for helping to repair the damages that have been done to the African psyche, hence reparations, because the term reparations come from repair, and so on. And so Ipadaji, for example, have been leading that discourse. Sister Olive Sampson has also been at the forefront of helping to shape that discourse. And we have argued that the state of Guyana, and immediately some of the Indian ideologues have pushed back against that. They've accused us of what they call double dipping, that we're trying to get reparations from the Europeans, and we are also trying to get reparations from the Guyanese. And well, I had a lot to say about Beto's. But Vincent was there, and Vincent responded to Beto Ramarak. And tonight we want to start our discourse there. I'm going to play Betoram's comments and Vincent's reaction, and then we're going to take it from there. But let me introduce Vincent Alexander first. Vincent, good evening.
Good evening, David. Good evening to the viewers.
How are you?
Not bad. Not bad. I'm all right.
If someone told you 20 years ago that you would be at the center of this discourse in 2023 in terms of trying to make sense of our ethnic and racial mix and how that feeds into our politics and our economics, would you have told them, yeah, I could have seen myself doing that? Or
I may have seen myself being involved in the discourse because it's an area that I have in the academic sphere paid attention to and been a resource person to the people of African descent in relation to these matters. So I may have seen myself being involved, not necessarily in the epicenter, in some regards being in the pedagogy, which was not something I could anticipate, has brought me into the epicenter.
Yes, and the reason I say that, Vincent, is that usually the ideologues from the African Guyanese side have come from the so-called radical left, the kind of Rodney Quayana kind of axis, or they've come from the African organizations. And you did not come out of, originally, you weren't part of the so-called African organizations. Now, were you part of that so-called WPA kind of radical left? So in that sense, you are unique in this discourse, yes or no?
I really started public expression based on research that I was doing at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Guyana. But I would say that the fact that I got involved in the research had a lot to do with my YSM background. And so, though one may not have seen me as the radical left, so to speak, WPA, I think that I had already developed in my early stages of the YSM a critical approach to the analysis of the Guyanese society. Because being a young politician, that is what we had to be involved in, understanding the society and seeking to proffer solutions. And so my background really is from the political perspective in the first instance, and then from the academic perspective, where I started to formally address these matters as a part of my research, as a research fellow at Institute of Development Studies, University of Guyana.
And I'm smiling, Vincent, because you mentioned YSM, and Dr. Eddie Green has a small book on race and politics in Guyana, but in that book, he showed the overlapping of YSM membership and ASCRE membership in the 1960s and the early part of the 1970s. And so there's that nexus. But you also, what you don't say very much, is that you actually lived in Africa because you studied there in Tanzania. Talk to us about how that also influenced your interest in this aspect of our discourse.
That is true. I spent approximately 2 years formally studying in Africa at a very interesting time because that was the peak of national liberation in Africa. And Tanzania was seen as the frontline country. And in fact, Mwalimu Nyerere was seen as the leader in that regard. And so I had a lot of exposure to literature on Africa, African liberation, going back to the struggles in Algeria and in Ghana. And you know, in Tanzania, at the University of Dar es Salaam, we used to have a Sunday morning session where the public can go and discuss issues pertaining to what one may call the New Left, the liberation movement. And so I had some exposure there too. And that's, in fact, the arena in which I first came into contact with the works of Walter Rodney, because he was at the University of Dar es Salaam as well and was involved in those Sunday morning sessions with people like Shivji and those guys. And so that did help a lot. And I must say, I paid significant attention to what was happening in Africa, close up. And in fact, did end up even writing at that early stage when I came back to Guyana in something called the Writings, a journal of the Young Socialist Movement, edited by Professor Edward Griffith, who was at that time our research secretary. I wrote an article on the liberation of Angola. And this was all based on my studies in Africa. But David, I would say the most significant thing about my sojourn in Africa that has influenced my being is, in a sense, the discovery of my being as a African Guyanese. Living in Africa, and you made the point early on that there was not a monolithic Africa, there were different tribes and all of that. When I went to Africa, I recognized that much of what I had become was based on my Guyanese exposure, and therefore I could be more easily recognized or identified as an African Guyanese as opposed to an African, because things evolve and Guyana has evolved. And I'm out of the bowels of Guyana, and with that evolution is the whole question of whether one could be referred to as a pure African or whether Africa has to be used as a descriptive term, African Guyanese. I prefer to see myself as an African Guyanese with African heritage. And that also has a little to do with my world outlook. I'm not one of those metaphysicists who see this universal spirit that resides in African Guyanese, in Africans. And I even argue that there is a fault line in that argument because the extent to which all humanity came from Africa, then if there is a universal spirit, then there's a universal, original African spirit that resides in all beings, all human beings. But from a sociological perspective, I would argue that when African Guyanese have been particularized in Guyana and have commonalities that have pitted them, put them into competition with other Guyanese, and therefore one has to deal with one's location in Guyana from the perspective of an African Guyanese.
Vincent Alexander, of course, making reference here to his time in Tanzania, at a time when Tanzania played a pivotal role in African liberation on the continent, but also the Pan-African movement under Julius Nyerere, who came to Guyana. And I have to say, I had the privilege as a young boy in those days, Kaunda, Nyerere, and Sosiresti Kama, and all the host of African leaders visited Guyana and the school children. We were out there welcoming them. But Tanzania with the Ujamaa ideology, nationalist ideology of Julius Nyerere made Nyerere really the hub of Tanzania, the hub of African liberation, because Africans had gone back to Africa, Africans from the diaspora, from the United States, from the Caribbean, when Nkrumah came to power in 1957. After Nkrumah was overthrown in 1964, something happened. Some of those people went to Tanzania, and some went to another country called what? Guyana. Which is a part of our history that we often don't get too much into. But certainly Tanzania was there on the front line, and Nyerere was seen as the leader. And the Sixth Pan-African Conference in 1974 was held in Tanzania. And so Tanzania is very, very, very important insofar as our discourses are concerned. But Vincent, who is a student of the creolization theory and practice, also points to while there's a similarities between Africans and African diasporans, there are also the differences. The experience of enslavement. If you're from Southern Africa, in Tanzania and Uganda and Kenya, they were not involved in the slave trade, for example, the Western slave trade. And our experience of enslavement, in a sense, created a new African. I think it's Carter G. Woodson who talked about the new Negro in the United States of America. And so, therefore, when we begin to talk about Africans and Blackness and so forth, we are entering a very complex area. We are entering a very complex discourse. That complexity, of course, is grounded in the shared experience of enslavement. But even within that shared experience of enslavement, there's a diversity within the African New World peoples. I always get my students laughing, Vincent, when I say, when you all Black Americans eat a piece of jerk chicken, you all say, God is spicy. And to us in the Caribbean, it's not spicy. You are Black like me, but you all call it spicy, our food, and so on, points toward diversity. Creolization, Vincent, as a very important factor in trying to understand the African Guyanese, the African Caribbean person.
It is critical, and in fact, very often is not seen from the right perspective. One can argue that in terms of creolization, that it is a process that may have had its origin even among the people of African descent, because they were bringing to bear different cultures and different traditions with a kind of infusion and integration that was producing something different. And I had reason in another program only last night to make the point that when the women who purchased Victoria did so, they weren't from one tribe. They were from different tribes. These people did not themselves originate from that plantation. They originated from various plantations, but they had emerged an outlook to life and commonalities based on the environment in which they found themselves and the way in which that environment treated them as one that caused them to become kind of, in fact, one, integrated into what could be referred to as the African Guyanese community, because as you rightly said, when our ancestors came, it's not just Africans who came. You had people from different tribes, and we often hear about the story in Mocha, Arcadia, where one tribe seemed to have been settled in Arcadia, another tribe settled in Mocha, and they used to have conflict between those two tribes. And the place now called Burnham Boulevard, which I think in those days was the Cemetery Dam, was the boundary between Mocha and Arcadia, and where a lot of the confrontation, be it verbal confrontation, or sometimes even physical confrontation, took place. And Mocha Arcadia only became one in leading up to the 1970 local government elections. But I'm told that Burnham visited Mocha Arcadia. He visited Mocha and Arcadia and addressed Mocha and Arcadia from Cemetery Dam and said to them that this damn nonsense of being at war has to stop, and declared that dam, Burnham Boulevard, and subsequently declared Mocha Arcadia one local government district as opposed to the two villages which it was. And to a very large extent, now, unless one digs deep, you can hardly discern the difference between somebody from Arcadia and somebody from Mocha. There's still differences. Some things are still latent. But that fusion came together in that village, that district called Mocha Arcadia. And so this process of creolization, which really is a mixing between different groups, and out of the mix emerging something new, and I dare say something superior, because it benefits from the strengths of both sides, something emerging new. And so, on one hand, at the very level of the people of African descent, we have that process of creolization. Now, that process obviously also included the Europeans with whom they interacted. And there are some people who simply see what occurred, who simply see creolization as a culturation, that is us succumbing to European culture. But I think it can well be argued that in fact what was taking place was a natural process of a fusion that led to something other than that which was there before. But there are those people who push back against this issue of creolization. And they push back against it in the context of the Guyanese person being a Creole person, in the sense that the mixing, the fusion across the ethnic groups have also led to the Guyanese as a Creole in that regard. Now, I'm not sure that we have had a perfect process because of our geographical location. We haven't all mixed in which we're one community, we've had a situation where different groups have settled in different places. But there's been a fair amount of that mixing, which has led to a personality that may be described as a Guyanese personality. And let me go back. That is one of the things I recognize of myself when I was in Africa. Comparing who I was to the Africans, I recognized that there was some identity separate and apart from my Africanness that could separate me from the Africans. And in fact, I never forget when a young African guy asked me what was my mother tongue. And up to that time, under the influence of the British, our parents would tell us that Creolese is bad English. We must learn to speak good English. So when this guy asked me what was my mother tongue, I said, well, we speak English. And his response was, well, all of us speak English all over the world. But what's your mother tongue? Which is your language? And that was an awakening for me that told me that there was something called Creolese that was peculiarly mine, as opposed to the African brothers. And at college thereafter, there were about 15, 13 of us, I think, at the time. We actually adopted Creolese as the language we use among ourselves, formally adopted it for the purposes of identity. Identity in a community where physically we looked like if we were a part of that community, but we were not recognized as a part because in our daily lives we exhibited a different being to the African being. And that fortunate experience was extended to my life in Moscow. I also went to university in Moscow, and there were scores of countries that were represented in Moscow. And what I found in Moscow, a number of things. I found that as Guyanese, we could identify as a group vis-a-vis every other group. Whether we were Indians or whether we were Africans, so to speak, we identified as one vis-a-vis other groups, vis-a-vis the Africans from Tanzania and wherever, the Indians from India and wherever, the Latinos. And then what I also found in Moscow was that the Guyanese associated and identified in a wider group called the Caribbean people. And I know this discourse has been going on recently too. The Caribbean people came together too. We recognized we were from different countries. We recognized that we were different. But we also recognized that in that community, we were a subgroup of that wider international community as Caribbean people. We had that recognition as well. But even in the course of that recognition, I must confess that in relating to other groups, we found that those of us who are African descent would more naturally relate to the Africans, and those of Indian descent would more naturally relate to the Indians, but relate to them not as Africans or as Indians, but of people of African and Indian heritage. And so heritage becomes a very critical part of the description of your being, because it relates you back to a process that has resulted in your current being, though there has been a qualitative change in that person, but there is still a root from which that person would have emerged.
Vincent Alexander here really walking us through this process. And it shows how race and ethnicity are not very easy to explain sometimes, but to digest because of the diversity, the diversity. I believe in the Creole theory, but I always say that I am a Creole, but I'm an African Creole.
It's like me saying I'm African Guyanese.
That's right. That's right. As opposed to the Amerindian who themselves, although they were here before, they themselves have been creolized. And our Indian brothers and sisters, although they have been academics and thinkers, and perhaps on the ground too, where they have resisted creolization. But I think even the Indians today have, in a sense, succumbed to the process of creolization. And they could resist it easily because when they came, they retained much of the culture that they came with. And so therefore they could resist creolization for a long time. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that. The other thing is that I hear discourses now on creolization and Creoles, as if Creoles are just mulattoes. That is people who are mixed between black and white. And that you made the point that among ourselves as Africans, we underwent that whole process of creolization. Now, I mean, of course, we speak Creolese, but my introduction to that thing was, and I'm interested in that Maka thing because I had never heard of it before. But there is a group next door to where I was born and where I grew up. That is South Annandale, where predominantly black people live there. And we always saw ourselves as different from them, and they always saw themselves as different from us. I don't know that we had conflict, but they call themselves Congo people. And we would say they come out of Congo pasture. In a sense, now that you look back, it's a kind of derogatory thing. So there must have been some tension there, right? They beat their drums with sticks. And we in Boston beat drums with the hands. All right? So you mentioned it, and I'm thinking back now, there was tension. Today, those lines are no longer there. People from Annandale now live in Buxton. But if you talk to them and you say, what your name? And he says, oh, you're Congo. We still refer to them that way. And there used to be a song they would sing when a Congo person died. They said, Congo Creole, one be one. See them a go away, one be one. Congo Creole. So the creolization went on among the African groups. Look at what they're calling themselves. Congo Creoles, as opposed perhaps to Coromantee Creoles. Right? So Vincent, I think you're really onto it here. And so when you listen, some people writing about the Creoles, you want to know what they're talking about. Because for them, Creole is just mulatto. And they don't have a sense of what the notion of creolization is. Of course, because they're lazy and they don't study. Any comments?
You know, in the Marcus situation, I think one tribe is the Akan. I don't quite remember what the other tribe was, but I think one was a Congolese tribe as opposed to the other one. You know, and it's really rich. I am intrigued when, for example, when I go to Kilduna.
Yes.
There is a group there that they have the drum. I'm trying to remember the terminology. It's not a drum they beat from the top. They have an auger in the drum.
Yes,
that
yes.
Pull, and that auger is what causes the drum to give out the sound. And they're quite distinctive. So whilst they are well integrated into Kilduna, if you go on Emancipation Day, you will see them, these old guys, I can't remember which tribe they're associated with, but they still have their own gathering with the tradition of their drum distinguishing them from anyone else. It's really intriguing. And it's really regrettable that there are some intellectuals who have sought to treat creolization as an acculturation process and as succumbing to something else. And there are other intellectuals who have sought to push back against creolization, which I will argue is a natural process. It is not an artificial, man-made, social engineered process. It is a natural human process derived from natural interaction. And there are some people who seek to push back against it, and they're like the extremists in some regards. Some extreme Hindus push back against it. And I was really educated when, on one occasion, I saw our good friend Vishnu Visram writing a letter paying homage to a Hindu leader in the quarantine and suggesting that one of the greater contributions the Hindu leader has made was to push back against creolization consciously. They said, well, there we have the problem.
Yes, yes.
Have a situation where people have accepted that we should not allow natural evolution, we should push back against it, and therefore, in that regard, seek to harden the lines of division. And in some instances, this whole idea of the Creole versus the others is racist because it suggests that the Creole is an inferior being and that those who have not been Creolized are superior. And that in itself is the very definition of racism, where one group sees itself as being superior to another group. So people can, in many regards, turn out to be, quote unquote, subconsciously racist. But insofar as they are racist, they present a problem in the process of the evolution of the nation and the people referred to as Guyanese.
The people referred to as Guyanese. Very good evening. And all my Congo friends and supporters. Guyana was a Congo, you know, because Guyana's people come out the Lusignan plantation, and a lot of them are the ones who settled in Annandale. And Guyana was born there in Lusignan, and his family moved to Buxton, whereas most of the others moved to Annandale, and that's why they always refer to Guyana as a Congo. And all my friends, Lynette Greenwood Changi, Vincent, I think you know them. Them there in Annandale, and they're regulars on this program. Changi, good night. Look, she there. Here she said, true. Lynette Greenwood, Bleeding Heart Congo. And yes, Lynette, I know you. I know you're glad that I'm discussing this story, talking the story. And we played a very important role in kind of bringing those communities together in the 1970s and the 80s around emancipation, but always recognize that the Congo people from Annandale, as we said, we call it Congo pasture, they were bringing something unique to the table. My other Congo friend, Colin Burke, out of Canada. You just looked at the way Cousin Irene, Miss Faddy, and Miss Rowe, you looked at the way they moved and they danced. And it was different from we in Buxton, Miss Morrison, and them, you know, they do it differently, or the Nancy people. When you think about people like Rapatap in my village, and so on, Rapatap is a Congo, right? And they play Nancy different from those of us over in Buxton, you know? And now that you think of it, there is that diversity in our sameness, which is very important. And Vincent, I want to thank you tonight for making that point, that people regard the Creole as inferior. And that all we mean when we talk about Creole are Africans who were born in Guyana or the Caribbean or the United States. All right? That's all. They were born here. They're of African heritage, but having been born here, they bring something that is different. They're incorporating the spiritual feeling of Africa and the spiritual feeling of the transplanted Africa on the plantations in the New World. Vincent, let's listen to our friend Beto on your response to him, and then we talk about it on the other side.
That is very plural. So I wish we had more discussion on this, because one of the things that I've seen in a lot of these books written by especially Indians is that the migration from India to the diasporic communities were pretty much voluntary, right? Which is, you can make an argument, yes, that's true, very different from the African experience. But the point is, we don't see a distinction between the history of Indians when you compare, Indian history to the experience of others. Yes, we are brown people. We can be united on certain issues and so on. So this brings me to a couple of quick points I do want to make, and which is something that troubles me. We cannot make the argument when we talk about the current state. The current state of Guyana is not the same state as the state that exists prior to 1966. By the same token, we can't make an argument, it's going to be a difficult argument to make, that the revolutionary government of Cuba under Castro is the same state as the Batista state. By the same token, we can say that the revolutionaries who fought to create a new state in the United States are the same, it represents the same state prior to that. You can argue for reparations in the United States because it's the same state that exists after independence, right? Which enforced and established slavery in the United States. When it comes to Guyana, my problem here is that if you're saying it is the same state, and this is the point I had made about something that David Hinds has said, you're double dipping, because you're making an argument on the one hand that those who practice slavery, right, the plantocracy, the absentee owners and so on, have to provide reparations. We've seen that with the fifth generation Gladstone family who came to Guyana. But if you're saying, okay, that's fine, which all of us agree, and nobody disagrees with that, right? We all support reparation. But now you're saying that the current state of Guyana has to pay Africans reparation because their blood and their bones and flesh are buried, in those dungeons where those oil are being kept. Then you're now saying, well, it's the Amerindians, it's the Indians, and it's the other people in Guyana who are now being asked to pay reparations. So you're double dipping. And I stand by that argument that I made. It is not the same state. And it's difficult to make that argument. The other thing I do want to make is I have read someplace a while back that the Native Americans who crossed the Bering Strait may have lived in Asia. So that probably means that they do have some DNA that is connected to my ancestral people in India. If that's the case, maybe the three Amerindian tribes that Vincent talked about that may have come before Africa, maybe the other five have the DNA of my ancestors from India. So therefore, I can now make the argument that my ancestors were here long before many of the Amerindians, way before the Africans who came, right? So we came before Columbus, if you want to make that argument. My point in saying that is this, and it comes back to the question, and I want to be very blunt about this, because we can't speak in a vacuum. Where does this end, right? The whole question of entitlement. Kimani talked about his personal experience. Well, my father was a very religious person. He would do his Lakshmi puja. Lakshmi is the goddess of wealth. He built a cottage. We lived there. He had 9 kids. Then he built a house, had one room, expanded that house. He bought some land, and that he was doing that while he worked at the estate, and he got hit by a punt that broke his hip, but he still continued. So my point is, we never complained. I've never heard him or anyone else complain about the fact that, well, it's the colonials, it's the British, who caused this high rate of suicide or alcoholism among Indians. They bear their shave, as we would say, and they continued. So my problem with this whole argument is that it comes back to this question again of entitlement, because I've heard it before. And what I have heard before is that, repeat what I said before. We came here before, we suffered more. We uplift Guyana 5,000 miles above the sea coast. Uh, Africans lifted, what, 100 million tons of dirt. That's in the report that Nigel Hughes quoted. A brilliant lawyer. I wouldn't have him as a math teacher, but he's a brilliant lawyer. I don't know how they came up with that figure. But again, I'm not trying to make a mockery of this issue, right? I'm not trying to be flippant. But there are others in Guyana who have progressed. They have worked their butt off. And I talked about before the show about a person named Harry Prashad, who had so many obstacles in his way. He started out as a woodcutter. He used to sell in the market. He buy a ship, bought a second one. He began to transport wood. And then he eventually said, okay, the heck with this. I'm going to live in India. He took his 6 kids and his wife. He went to India. He lived there for a while, but then he came back, and then he built this town called Prashad Nagar with his own strength. To me, that is the strength of entrepreneurship. Nobody gave him a handout, right? There was no affirmative action to help him. He did this all on his own, and there are many Indians like that in Guyana. Now, we can make the argument that, well, Barnum did a lot of things. He crushed people. On the one hand, he allowed them to have the co-op, right? Um, but on the other hand, he established an authoritarian system that took the power away from local people. So the question is, where do we go from there? And if we're using history as hindsight, we can't simply say that because of history. I mean, the Jews are saying that today, but they were the promised people. They built the temple, right? The Babylonians destroyed it. They built it again. Then the Romans came and destroyed it. Then they went all over Europe, and Hitler did his thing. And then they came back and says, look, this is, the Old Testament says, this is our land. We belong here, right? They can make that claim because they can defend it, right? They have the guns and whatever. So long story short, my point is this. I think we are trying to intellectualize this too much, especially when you have people like Eric Phillips talking about a certain percentage of land. In a country that is so big, you have less than 1 million people, and we have an oil wealth on top of our heads, and we are still, digging ourselves into battle, and we're arguing about land. So it's an important issue when it comes to learning about history, but when we use that historical knowledge or that history and try to make a claim on the state, a different state, mind you, that you owe me this. And at the same time, if that state is going to act on that demand, it means that you are now putting other people at a disadvantage who have sacrificed themselves over generations to be where they are today. And the question is, that one of the things that people are asking today in the United States, for instance, which we support, things like affirmative action and so on. If you don't have a lot of business people, okay, let's create programs to do that. But where and when does it end? And so far, I've asked these questions many times before, and nobody seems to have an answer for me, right? You had 28 years of a government that established itself through institutions, through policies, and so on. But yet, we seem to forget that, and we now want to start from scratch and go back to the history book, right? So I guess my point and my frustration with this, as you can tell, is that we seem to be using that piece of history, right, to put ourselves on the pedestal. Because I started out by saying we don't have a lot of Indians who could make these kinds of arguments, right? And maybe if we did, we can get to that point where we can say, look, there is that history, but there is something else about history which we can take and say, look, let's come up with a plan, right? a plan which can make things work. And that means we have to discuss a model that can work, an economic model, a political model, that could provide land to everyone and make the system work for everyone. I don't think it's going to be an easy task, but I think that is probably where the focus should be.
Vincent? I think you're muted, Vincent. You're muted. You're muted.
You're still muted, Vincent. That's it. You're good. You're good now. You're good to go.
I'm still muted.
No, man. Yeah, I can hear you
now.
I
You
can
hear
you.
me? That is
Yeah,
muted
yeah.
here. Anyway, I want to start this contribution following on from what Bethlehem has said, because I think it's a critical issue and may well be the stumbling block to where you want to. I don't accept his argument of the sameness of state. Well, I don't accept.
No, I'm saying the
it's not
state.
the sameness. It is not the sameness.
I'm saying the state is different. It's not the same state.
Because what is the state? The state really is the interrelationship among people in a particular geographic space, much of which interrelationship is realized through the institutions and the legal frameworks that are at play. And therefore, the state definitionally is what the state is. And in circumstances where those relationships have not changed, where those institutions have remained the same, and where the legal framework has remained the same, it's the extent to which what the state is today is a reflection and a carryover of what the state was yesterday. And it is only through transformation that we can talk about, quote unquote, a different state, though definitionally the state is the state. And so the extent to which, for example, we have a state that does not teach Guyanese history, and therefore at that relational level of recognition of understanding of each other, much has not changed, is the extent to which that state as quote unquote a successor state has to bear the responsibility of the previous state, if we can use terms like successor and previous, because the state is the state. So that in Cuba, for example, the state is the state. It is a relationship among the people, realized largely through institutions. But in Cuba, the way in which the state operates has changed. And so that current state has taken the responsibility we are talking about and has brought about the transformation. And the argument is, forget whether it's 28 years of the PNC or 23 years of the PPP, that our state has not necessarily gone through that kind of transformation and has continued to perpetuate the ills that we are referring to. And therefore, when we talk about double dipping, we are talking about reparations from the standpoint of what happened before emancipation. And I call that in the last occasion external reparation. Those who are here, they've left, or they created certain damage before, and they are in debt. They're indebted. But the extent to which relationships continue to inflict on people, and the extent to which relationships continue to make people disadvantaged is the extent to which there is still need outside of the external reparations for equitable policies and equitable programs to bring about what I may refer to as equalization. I would concede that this is not simply pitting one group of people against the other group of people, because there are arguments where other groups also require some kind of equitable action because we weren't necessarily affected in the same way. But the extent to which we were affected is the extent to which that requires equitable action for the purposes of equalization. And here's where you have this big problem in Guyana, where the government contends, and they write the United Nations to say, well, there's no problem, we have done A, B, C, and everybody has the same access. But you can't have the same access if, as Kimani earlier said, you're not starting from the same position. The child who goes to the blackboard and is short is not in the same position as the child who goes to the blackboard and is tall. And therefore, the state, the deliverer of education, has to put in place a mechanism so that the short child can equally get to the top of the blackboard as the tall child. And it's in that context we're talking about the responsibility of the state, because it's a successor state, and if it is not in gender transformation, then it's operating on premises that are a source of the problem and has a responsibility to correct that in the quest for equalization and for the quest of emancipation and freedom and all the terms that one may wish to apply. So that, for example, if we talk about the question of lands, and I stated two categories. I didn't bulk everything on the ancestral lands. I stated two categories, and I did that for purpose because of my own disposition to the question of ancestral lands. And I did say ancestral lands, quote unquote, because I know what's the universal definition of ancestral lands and the applicability of that definition. But locally, we understand what we mean by ancestral lands. I understand what I mean by it. Not in relation to all of the lands in Guyana, but in relation to which you were bequeathed, having been purchased by our ancestors. If we look at those lands, and we see the legal regime which has been developed in relation to those lands, we see a situation where quote-unquote ancestral lands now fall under the aegis of local democratic organs. It doesn't matter to me which government is in place, because the government is only one element of the state, but it's a driving element. Those lands fall under the aegis of local authority. And so, for example, if you go to Fowles Buxton, you now have a situation where in Fowles Buxton, the state, an organ of the state, has a responsibility for how those lands are treated. With a flawed system, which in treating with those lands does not give recognition to the fact that those lands were purchased by the people of African descent. And through institutional and legal arrangements fell under the state, which now can appropriate those lands away from the people of African descent. And it's in that context, for example, that I call for a resuscitation of village councils, so that at least on the question of lands, you can have the village, which to some extent is homogeneous, responsible for lands which it would have inherited from the ancestors, and not have a council that is unrelated to those lands, making a determination of what will happen with those lands, and by virtue of that, dispossessing today people of African descent of lands which were purchased. Now, our state has done some institutional changes and a legal framework on lands. And what have they done? They have abolished the institution that allowed for people to occupy and subsequently own lands or state lands. They've abolished that. So they're protecting a particular interest, but they have retained the institution that allows people to occupy and over years acquire lands that belong to others. So the state has now protected itself from that kind of acquisition. But at the institutional and legal level, it has retained the old instruments that have facilitated dispossession, and in this instance, of lands which belong to people of African descent. So that let's forget about reparations pre-emancipation and look at what has evolved post-emancipation and the way in which the state has represented interests, have discriminated, and therefore raised the question that we are raising in the decade of justice. The system has continued to be unjust and has imposed injustice on people, and that is the kind of rectification that is being called for. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is I agree, and the argument has been proffered here, education is critical. It's very, very critical. Because what education should seek to do is to create an understanding across the board of the differences and the commonalities of the ethnic groups. And in that context, to create an understanding, what I refer to as mutual respect. Because we hear the argument every day about who has been able to do what and who has not been able to do what. And we pose the question as why who has not been able to do what, has not been able to do what, when others have been able to do it. And it's only through an understanding of the way in which our society has evolved and the differentiation of the evolution of the peoples, not only the material level, but including the material level, but at the psychological level, that can give an explanation that does not seek to say, what is very often said. I do recall Yesu Prasad, when IPED was being established, coming to the university to talk about the establishment of IPED. And here he was essentially in the first instance getting funds from, I think, the Germans to establish IPED. And I said to him, sir, given the history of the people of African descent and their involvement in business, with IPED being formulated, shouldn't IPED seek to have an understanding of why is it that the people of African descent are positioned where they're positioned, and to see how this organization, a part of the state, could seek to address the causal factor in relation to what you're saying about people of African descent and business. And his response was, the man got almost red on me and said that people have to be industrious and to work hard. And in a sense, that's not his problem. But he was receiving these funds, not as Yesu Prasad. He's receiving these funds as an institution in Guyana that should be addressing the realities of Guyana, but was not doing so because of a disposition. And so I'm saying, and I repeat, that we have to get to the point where we understand what informs those prejudices and what informs those stereotypings about each other, to the point where we can become respectful, but also the state should take the responsibility for dealing with the causal factors so that we can all have an opportunity to approach the opportunities that are available from a standpoint of some degree of psychological and material equalness, as opposed to the psychological and material unequalness. Bearing in mind, I'm not applying this to one ethnic group. I'm saying that different ethnic groups have been affected in different ways, and we have to be addressing this issue as it has arisen. Beto, you often raise the question of the absence of Indo-Guyanese activists, so to speak, to represent the Indian cause. And I've said this before. African Guyanese do not have a single institution for historical reasons to represent them. And so what has occurred in the African Guyanese community is a whole range of institutions, and they're not all necessarily in sync, that seek to represent the African Guyanese. In the absence of a historical institution, unlike the Indo-Guyanese, who have, I would contend, the Hindu body, which is not merely religious body. It's a whole framework of principles, of way of life and all of that. And therefore there is the ongoing inculcation, and I dare say representation of the interests of the people of Indian descent by virtue of the impact of that institution. And you can't equate their state, the state of the people of African descent, who do not have such, quote unquote, a monolithic institution. And so I think that.
But just a question, Vincent. I'm just curious about this. You're referring to the Vindhya Prasad's institution and her being a Hindu person in the government. Not
to her as a Hindu person in the government. I'm referring to the Hindu establishment as an institution, as a part of this state we are talking about. And that in the Hindu institution, on one hand, they're able to relate to Hindus in a rather monolithic way. Rather, I know that there are some segregations, but rather monolithic way, so that there's inheritance and things that are taking place. And they're able to have people of Indian descent contribute and speak to things from that monolithic perspective. And so that there isn't a need for these various groups, as is the case, the African community.
Come on, Vincent. You're
less monolithic. Less monolithic.
You have to start winding
I'm not going to go to the political parties aspect. I'm going to go to the rhetoric.
Okay, but you've said a lot there at the end, which I really I think that's going to be a good topic for us. I mean, we're only 20%. There's two of us here, so there's probably like 18% left in Guyana.
Kimani's not here, you know. Kimani's not here.
But that's
we're equal. Myself and Ravi are here, and
Vincent Alexander there giving a thorough response to Beto Ramramara. Vincent, as you were giving that response, and you took a second look at it, and I've looked at it, and you listened to Beto Ram, who is a professor who is obviously thinking these things through. And the questions he's raising, you and I know of text and subtext. Put in context as we continue this discussion, and we are going to come back to continue it. Those of you in the audience who are saying we can't finish this tonight, and we know that. Vincent, put in context what Beta Ram is really getting
at. You know, when one does ethnic studies in Guyana, one could see that one of the big issues is being stereotyping and prejudices. That's been the mechanism used by the colonizers in the first instance to divide and rule. And what has emerged in that is definitions and attributes of personalities and groups. So that the people of African descent are described as barbarous, violent, lazy, and things like that. People of Indian descent are described as industrious, people who are able to peaceful and things like that. And these descriptions, as I said, are stereotypes. And these descriptions also, in many regards, speak to the question of racism, because they are identifying some people as culturally superior to others. And what they do not do is give recognition, on one hand, to the contributions of the different peoples to the evolution of Guyana, and to give recognition to the circumstance and the consequence of the emergence of different people, not the emergence, the perpetuation of different peoples for different reasons, many of which are founded on the way in which the country was structured, how rights were attributed. African Guyanese had no rights to license to trade. Portuguese got the rights to license to trade. African Guyanese had their lands flooded and were forced to take to the hinterland and to the public sector. That's not the experience of other Guyanese, and in very many instances where there was land settlement, Indo-Guyanese were greater beneficiaries of the land settlement. African Guyanese, who themselves already had a disposition to the land based on their immediate post-emancipation experience. So that the state and that body of people called the government, who are the drivers of how the state operates, if they are dealing with us as equals, they have to recognize the unequal evolution of us, or the inequitable evolution of us. And in an attempt to treat us as equals, give us equitable treatment to create the equal base, the equalization, for us then to be able to equally access the opportunities that are available to the state. And that is not being done. And in fact, the government, I'm speaking out to the current government, has specifically articulated what Bertrand was saying.
Yeah.
That they ain't got no problem that is peculiar to the people of African descent. And if there's anything peculiar about them, is their laziness and them not being industrious. And so that's not our problem. You got to solve your own problem. The fact of the matter is, it's a problem of the state, because it is a consequence of the manner in which the state conducted the affairs of Guyana. Thus, disadvantages in materially and creating psychological dispositions that are now problematic for the people of African descent in a competitive situation where access suggests that we are all at the same material and psychological level, which is in fact not the case. And therefore, when we talk about reparations, I separated it into two periods. We talk about reparations, what the Europeans did to our enslaved brothers and sisters, what they owe us for the labor. But after emancipation, when we were all then seen to be persons, because in the first instance we were animals, after emancipation, we were all seen to be persons, there was a continuation of the differentiation that was discriminatory. And therefore, that too has to be catered for. And in doing so, I'm accepting that there may be spheres where Indo-Guyanese and Portuguese Guyanese were also affected in the hierarchy, which was European and then coming down the line. And so they too need some equitable treatment. But insofar as that I'm speaking from the African Guyanese perspective, the argument is that there's need for reparations for pre-emancipation and there's need for reparations for post-emancipation. The reparations for post-emancipation not necessarily being the same as the pre-emancipation, because what we need institutional and legal rectification post-emancipation, and in some instances, material assistance to bring about the equalization that is required for us to refer to each other as Guyanese, one Guyana, accessing the country's resources and the country's patrimony. And Guyana will not be able to be at peace until we can come to respect the realities of the different groups, respect their realities, respect what is required of them in terms of, and here's where the decade comes in. The UN obviously understands what we're talking about, and therefore they have coined the decade talk about recognition. Do you recognize who these people are? Justice, do you recognize that there was injustice and therefore that needs to be addressed? Development is a consequence of not having the recognition required, being unjustly treated. They have been deprived the development opportunity. And therefore this decade is intended to address those three things. And it is the state that is in the position, in the main, to address those things because they all were caused by the state and can only be recognized by the state. Understanding the state to be not just simply the government, but the institutions that regulate our interrelationship as citizens, that we need to adjust those institutions. The legal framework that provides our relationships, and that framework, in many instances, which land is now being treated. The whole question of how African Guyanese could have and continue to lose land under a regime of local government that allows people who are not the inheritors of the land to determine what happens to it. And under the legal regime of prescriptive rights that allows an African Guyanese to lose, or any Guyanese to lose land, while the state has now said, no, we're not going to lose land. We're going to protect the state from losing land. So that the thing is hilarious. Here is a government saying, look, we are the government of all of the people. This land belongs to all of the people. But the people will not have the right, out of occupation over time, to become owners of parcels of land. People who own the land as a collective will not enjoy the right to become owners of parcels based on occupation. But individuals who own land can lose what they own to other people based on occupation. Clearly discriminating against the citizens, and the regime, the institution that regulates land is discriminatory. That needs to be addressed. Others might benefit, but we, the people of African descent, are identifying that prescriptive rights need to be addressed differently, and that the way in which local authorities have inherited the right to manage African lands has put us in a position where we are losing currently our lands under that management, and that needs to stop if we are to recognize us as the owners and to recognize that the manner in which we lose the lands are unjust, and to recognize that the lands are important as an asset for our development. And that if your education system does not help us to understand our origins, our contributions, and our being, then even if we have the land, you may not have the disposition to do what is required. And so you fall into the category of your superstar saying you're not industrious, when in fact, your being has been determined by factors beyond your control, and that those factors now have a responsibility to provide an environment for the revival of your natural being rather than your manufactured being.
Vincent Alexander here tonight. Vincent, thank you so much, my brother. We're going to do this again. I've been reading your comments. Some of you want to call in show so that you can ask questions of Vincent and others. We're going to do that. This is a series we are beginning. You're going to see a lot more of Vincent and others in the coming weeks. We're going to open the phone so you all can ask questions. I appreciate your appreciation of this. Dr. Hines, we must do more of these shows. Yes, we are going to do more of these shows. And yes, we are going to give you all a chance to call in and to ask questions and to comment. We're going to come back next week with Vincent because we're going to continue. Note, I want you all to note where we're ending. I started by saying we are at a point where we have resources. And the question is that all groups in the society are going to make demands on the government for access to those resources. Vincent ended there. And Vincent is saying that there's a narrative that is saying that our access to those resources has to start where we are, and that we are starting equally, equitably. And Vincent is saying, no, because of the process, there is no equitability. There's no equality of condition. There's no equality of condition. And therefore, those who are in a better condition are going to have more access to those resources. And so people like Beto do not want us to correct the inequities that have been brought on by the system. So when they talk about Prashad Nagar and this man, our people created 200 and more of Prashad Nagars. All them villages that we have. Are you telling me about Prashad Nagar creating one thing? Oh, he did it without handouts. So did our people do it with handouts? They never borrow money from a bank to do it. And you see, it is that narrative. And I started out by saying, in any struggle, there are always those in the society who, because of opportunities, who will have to make the case for the group in the public sphere that they call ideologues, etc., etc. Unfortunately or fortunately, people like Vincent and myself and others are saddled with this task. And that is what we are doing. We're not making war. We're not trying to displace anybody. Note what Vincent said. Vincent said other people also have problems in terms of their own condition that will have to be corrected. And I want to end with this. I said, you go to a comfort walk, You get the All African Nation Walk. And then you get the All Guyanese Nation Walk. They invoke all the different African spirits, and then they invoke the Chinese spirit, the Amerindian spirit, the Portuguese spirit, the East Indian spirit. I'm saying there's something in the African being that recognizes the existence of others. And that creolization process is very important here. So while the African is the African is conscious of its environment, as always be. And like I say, what better place to look to that for that than in the religious? And I'm arguing here that a one Guyana notion, a one people, one nation, has always been part of the African perspective. It is part of the Indian perspective, the Amerindian perspective, etc., etc. But one has to exploit it. One has to exploit that instinct in the group. And we are saying we are African, but we're also Guyanese. Not because David Hines says it or Vincent Alexander said, go to an African spiritual religious service and you see there. Vincent, closing thoughts, my brother, until next week.
Well, David, as you said, this is a very important conversation. And I would really look forward to the continuation of the conversation, because this conversation is, in some regards, abstract. And its concreteness is being played out in relation to how the government has treated with G. And there we have specific documentation now to show what's the government's disposition on the people of African descent and G specifically. And so we certainly need to go beyond these abstractions to apply what is in fact happening based on these abstractions.
Thank you very much, Vincent. And next week, yes, next week we are going to be back. As we said, this is a series we are beginning here, and we're going to be back next week. Thank you very much, Vincent Alexander. And I want to say something before I go tonight. Talking about African people's business is not racist. It's not about prioritizing Africans over Indians. Talking about Indian people business is not prioritizing Indian people over Amerindians. Talking about Amerindian business is not prioritizing Amerindians over Indians. We, each group needs to bring into the public space, its fears, its concerns, its accomplishments. Each group needs to do that. And it is out of that discourse, out of that action, that will emerge a Guyana. Let 6 flowers bloom, because we're a nation of 6 races. Let 6 discussions permeate our airwaves. At some point in your journey, you have to stop and do one thing at a time. I've said on this program that I have decided to dedicate this period of my activism to making the case for African Guyanese, so that tomorrow I don't have to do that. That tomorrow I can make the case for Guyana, and that I can make the case for the Caribbean, because I'm African Guyanese, I'm Guyanese, I'm Caribbean, I am Black, I am all of those things. I come from the bowels of the poor. And so always my gaze and my concern is, how are we going to get those without? How to get them with? We're all of those things. And so on a day when you hear me speak as an African, do not be fearful that I am anti-Indian. I'm speaking about African today so that tomorrow we can all speak together Guyanese. My friend Ravidev talks about a Guyanese narrative. My problem with that is Ravidev wants to substitute a Guyanese narrative in place of an African narrative or an Indian narrative because it suits him. a Guyanese narrative to know today without any issue about equalization and equity and all those things. Ravi wants to skip those things. And he wants to talk about a Guyanese narrative based on our condition as we are. And our condition as we are, it is uneven. And we can't have a one Guyana that is an uneven one Guyana. An unequal one Guyana. That is my problem with the president's one Guyana and Ravi Dev one narrative. They're speaking from the same hymn book. They want a one Guyana and a one Guyana narrative based on our unequalness. And it is the task of Amerindians and Africans to fight for racial equality and racial equity. Because then one Guyana will have meaning. Good night to all of you. Lynette, yes, I'm going to open the phone. I'm going to open the phone. Lynette, Lynette from Buxton and Lynette from Annandale, my Congo friends. My Congo friends. I love you all. Tomorrow night, Dr. Vince Adams is going to be here, and we're going to be rocking it. We're going to be rocking it. You all in Brooklyn know about the Parkway Rock. We're going to rock it on the Parkway. That's Roots Man. You all think I know my little story? I know my little story. Good night. Love you all with all my heart.